Hi, I'm Jim Knotts, President and CEO of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. Welcome to today's virtual reading of the names. 2022 marks the 40th anniversary of the dedication of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. As part of our commemoration, we'll host an in-person reading of the names at the wall from November 7th through 10th, 2022, when all 58,281 names on the wall will be read aloud. In the lead up to that event, we'll be reading names each day online while sharing the photos of these heroes. For our daily virtual reading, the names of the service members will be read by month and day of death between the years 1956 and 1975 in alphabetical order for the given day. We apologize in advance for any mispronunciations. Know that our readers are doing their best to honor these service members. We hope you'll listen and watch each day and share with others as we remember and honor those who gave their lives during the Vietnam War.
Frank Carl Ambrosio, Edwin Apont, Kenneth Charles Applegate, John Burdett Appleton, Bobby Joe Ard, Harold Kingsley Armstrong, Billy Ray Baker, Walter Frazier Barnes, Cosmo Leonard Barone, Donald Barrett, David Harum Bass, Carol Raymond Bauer, Lawrence Edward Bauer, Charles Joel Bem Jr., William Russell Beller Jr., Walter Paul Bem, James Stephen Bennett, Frederick Wood Bivens Jr., Richard Patrick Blanton, Dan Arthur Bolton Jr., Larry Franklin Brashears, Danny Ray Brotz, Patrick Lewis Bruckner, Michael Allen Burns, Ernest Burton, George Benjamin Bird Jr., John Patrick Byrne, Benny Dale Cash, George Andrew Cervantes, Robin Lee Chilvier, John Vincent Schutis, Walter Anthony Cicciani, Lavelle Franklin Cohen, Michael Ira Colley, Vernell Collins, Dennis Conry, Robert Leslie Cornell, Larry Alfonso Cunningham, John R. D'Agostino Jr., Cantrell Monroe Daniel III, Lauren Keith Davey, Richard Harold Davis, Albert J. Davis, Clifford Gordon Davis, Robert James Diedrich, Michael Ronell Diggs, Luther James Doss Jr., Thomas Edward Doer, Charles Howard Duty, William Dale Early, Joseph Milton Eason, Robert Franklin Elston, Richard Leroy Endicott, Robert John Enidi, Larry David Epstein, Michael David Earhart, Howard W. Erickson Jr., Jack Charles Everts, Antonio Falco, David Kent Feller, Philip Wayne Flanagan, Daniel Flores, Gary Wayne Fox, Philip Gilbert Franklin,
Charles Lee Frisbee, Joe Cecilio Garcia, Jose I. Garcia Maldonado, Eddie Augustus Gardner, Marcelo C. Garza Jr., Carl Merlin Gebhardt Jr., Roy Lee Gibson, Carl Reed Gibson, John Anthony Glorioso, Gerald Eugene Goral, Glenn Allen Gordon, Thomas George Graff, Gerald Arlen Gransbury, George Gregorius, Luis Fulda Guillermin, David Spencer Hackett, Cecile Morris Hagler, Stephen Thomas Hall, Douglas Paul Halleck, William Howard Hancock II, Jerome M. Hanrahan Jr., Jerry Donald Helms, John Albert Hernandez, Richard Hernandez, Dale Joseph Hess, John Palmore Holcomb, Nicholas Lee Hollingsworth, Jerry Wayne Hood, Donnie Edward Horton, Ernest Richard Howell, John Robert Hunter, John Franklin Hunsell, Howard Robert Heisel, Timothy James Ives, Ray Don James, Danny Wayne Jarvis, Roger Wardell Jenkins, Gary Allen Johnson, Donald Ray Johnson, Paul Conrad Johnson, Larry Neal Jones, Larry Kurt Kaiser, Charles Thomas Colliher, Kevin Reynolds Kelleher, Sieber J. Kelly, Julius Allen Kessler III, Richard Lee Kinney, Carl Edward Klina, Glenn Lester Knobloch, Robert John Kotick, Raymond John Krupinski, Dale Lynn Cruz, John Franklin Lawrence, Larry Edward Lawson, Donald Ralph Ledley, Larry James Leindecker, Edward R. Latorna, Jr., Donald Peter Lindsley, Samuel D. Lovett, Giancarlo Lucchesi, Sammy Ray Lusk, Larry Eugene Lutz, Edward Leonard Mann, Jr., Donald Ray Marlowe,
Eduardo Marquez, Jr., Harold B. Marshall, Leonard Martin, Jr., Robert Eugene Masseth, John Charles Matheson, Peter Mazzillo, Jr., Randy Neal McPhee, Robert Allen McPherson, Lawrence Joseph McRae, David Philip Medina, Darrell Jean Meidinger, William Alfred Meister, Antonio Mendoza, Michael S.B. Matoyer, Joseph Michkowski, John Thomas Micret, Paul Lynn Miller, Roger Dale Mills, James Mines, Jr., Michael Miranda, Joseph Robert Mitchell, Jr., Manuel Moore, Roger Wayne Morgan, Michael Roy Morgan, Murray Sims Mosley, Adam Serna Najjar, Alexandro Navarez, Alan Emil Norris, George Clyde Norris, Raleigh Melvin Northouse, Russell Willis Noyes, John Michael Odell, Peter Richard Aumann, John Woodrow Osborne, John Leslie Paget, Francis Michael Palma, Robert Dwayne Palmore, Ronald Eugene Parr, John Emilio Pasquantonio, Marvin Paulson Jr., Esperidion Perez, Edward Lee Perry, Elmer Joseph Perry Jr., Donald Lee Peterson, Norman Ira Phipps, Robert Edward Peach, Freddie Richard Pitts, Harold Laverell Poole, Milton Emmett Prescott Jr., James Edward Prieb, Soren Pripp, James Thomas Pruitt, Larry Wayne Rabrin, James Arthur Randall, Jerome Rawlings, Johnny Jean Reed, Scott Douglas Richardson, Lonnie Barry Roberts, Walter R. Robinson Jr., David Robert Rogers, William Jr. Roldan, Frank Theodore Roth, David Paul Roy, Edward T. Russell,
Fernando Sainz Saldana, Luis Adrian Santillano, Michael Eugene Santos, Marvin Albert Schaefer, Arthur Gary Showerman, Robert James Shaley, Richard Travis Schmitz, Bruce Hassel Scragg, Melvin Douglas Seagraves, George Melvin Seal, John Leslie Sensing, James Everett Shanks, Robert Joseph Shannon, Edward Minot Shelton, Jr., Charles Shiver, Jr., Barry Jan Short, George Sidelko, Samuel Arnold Singer, Charles Lee Smalling, Jean Darrell Smith, John Raymond Smith, Ricky Jean Smith, Larry Michael Smith, Bruce Wayne Stolley, Raymond Ernest Stanley, David Walton Staton, Francis Ernest Stewart, Harry Nelson Stonecipher, Gordon Edward Stout, George Thomas Strideron, Charles Edward Tate, Harold Paul Tatum, Harry Terry, Alan Lee Terry, Leon Anthony Tekowski, Ernest William Tews, Paul Thorick, Jr., John Francis Tino, Jr., Alexander Siros, Gyler Neal Tulp, Frank Michael Valentine, Harold J. Verheller, Jr., Robert Alfred Vinton, Jr., Alan Kurt Ward, Dennis Gordon Warfield, Jack Allen Wetzel, Jr., James Henry Weisenhunt, James E. White, Eddie Joe White, Paul Timothy Whittington, William Wilkowski, Jr., Dorsey Berwin Williams, Gerald Stewart Williams, Robert Lee Williams, Fred Thomas Williams, Alfred Melvin Wolfe, Lloyd Joseph Wood, Sr., John Braxton Woodall, Wayne Howard Woodard, James Ronald Worley, Larry Thomas Yielding.